Okay, we'll get started here. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Peter Cornelison. I am a Hood River City Councilman and for the last 15 years an employee of Friends of the Columbia Gorge. I grew up in northeastern Ohio and moved to Oregon first in 1972. Who was here in 72 or earlier? Great. So you remember Tom McCall, a hero to many of us, created helped create the wonderful land use laws we have, the Bottle Bill, the Beach Protection Act. And I was a student on the University of Oregon campus and saw the marches against the ROTC building and other things going on then. And graduated in 1976 in community service and public affairs. I left Oregon in 1980 and went back east to work on a small business, and then returned in 2000 to moving to Hood River. Friends of the Columbia Gorge has three distinct roles, and I'm going to talk basically about Friends of the Gorge first, then about the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area, and then about a number of campaigns that I've been involved in over the years. It seems like there's unfortunately no limit to the threats and economic schemes that people have for the Columbia Gorge. And Friends of the Gorge has been the defender against many of those things. We have Friends of the Columbia Gorge has 8,000 members, and thanks to those of you that are members, and we welcome anybody that wants to become one. Most of our funding comes from individuals. Our annual budget is around $3 million. We have 24 staff, and our offices are in Portland, but we have field staff in Washougal, the Washington Western Gateway to the Gorge, and in Hood River. We just completed a $5.5 million land campaign to buy 400 acres in the gorge to preserve it, also for recreation. Friends of the Gorge has four roles. We're here, first of all, to preserve the gorge. That's how we got started, and to uphold what's called the Snickers, the cultural, the scenic, natural, cultural, and recreation resources of the gorge. That's enshrined in the National Scenic Act, which passed in 1986. I'm a part of the conservation staff. My boss, Michael Lang, is a brilliant guy. He's got a photographic memory, and he's adept at the law, science, and also public advocacy and lobbying. My counterpart in Portland, the conservation organizer, works with me, and then we've got two staff attorneys, because oftentimes when it comes down to it, we have to use the law to achieve preservation of the gorge. We're also educators and explorers. We lead over 100 hikes a year. I just was lucky because I got to lead a kayak trip last weekend down by Foca Rock and beautiful Cape Horn. We also have a couple programs for school kids. We own over 1,000 acres in the gorge, which we manage both for preservation and for recreation. We have a couple great trails on some of our properties. And we have a new role, which is being a connector. We're working on a 200-mile loop trail down the Oregon side of the gorge, crossing over at the Dalles, and going back on the Washington side of the gorge. That's called Gorge Towns to Trails. So,
Gorge, what kind of trails?
It's called Gorge Towns to Trails.
Gorge Towns to Trails.
Towns to Trails, right. And the idea is that, you'd leave Portland, you'd walk maybe to Bridalveil, maybe to as far as Cascade Locks, spend the night, then do the next portion to Hood River. And did you notice the construction on Highway 84? There's maybe you didn't see it if you haven't gone east of here, but there's a very ambitious project to reconnect the historic Columbia River Highway going from Troutdale to the Dalles. The state is spending a lot of money on it, but it'll be possible to go by bicycle or by foot all the way to the Dalles by 2022. They're restoring. They're going to blow a new tunnel through Mitchell Point because it was destroyed when the freeway was put in. So it's a neat project. So I'd like to give you an idea of the history. We heard some on the paddle wheeler, but I'd like to tell you some more about both the geologic and natural history of the gorge and the Native American history. So to make sure I get it right, I'm going to read some of this. The first entry here is that millions of years ago, like 40 to 20 million years ago, mud flows poured out of volcanoes, covering the land with thousands of feet of ash boulders and cobble. You can see this on the formations throughout the gorge. Then the next thing that happened is there were lava flows that erupted in eastern Washington hundreds of times and covered the gorge in layers of lava. And kind of the interesting thing is that hot spot that was in eastern Washington eventually moved eastward and is now responsible for Yellowstone National Park. Then about 2 million years ago to 700,000 years ago, hundreds of volcanoes erupted along the Cascade Crest. And the river continued to flow and carved its way through the Columbia Gorge. And the Cascade Crest is just slightly east of here. Mount Defiance is the highest point between Mount Hood and Mount Adams at 5,000 feet. So this region gets an amazing amount of strong weather. Some engineers came through from Colorado that had just completed the passage of I-70 over the tunnel, and then the passage of I-70 over the Rockies through the Continental Divide. And they compared that road, the I-70, with I-84 because of the number of turns, the intense weather. We get huge windstorms. Maybe some of you have experienced that. And intense winter weather. A famous or a thing that I keep in my memory is seeing somebody walking out at Multnomah Falls with tire chains going horizontally in a winter storm. The wind was just so strong it blew his tire chains sideways, and he had instructions here. Which I doubt he ever got the chains on his car. Then 14,000 years ago, a series of floods came through, like 100 times. There was a dam, an ice dam, right kind of on the Idaho, Washington border, 2,000 feet high. And this enormous body of water, pool, developed behind it, right around Missoula. I think, what's the figure here? When the lake was full, it contained 600 million cubic feet of water. How much is that? Imagine a block of water a mile high, miles wide, and stretching from Bonneville Dam to San Francisco. So there's a lot of water. So when this ice dam broke, the floods roared down here 1,000 feet high at 65 miles an hour, and they scoured the walls of the gorge, and that represents the steep sides of the gorge that you see, especially through here. And it basically happened 100 times. So it's pretty amazing that way. Then, as we heard from the steamboat captain 500 years ago, that the Table Mountain and Hamilton Mountain slid, causing this 14 miles of landslide, some of which blocked the Columbia Gorge and impounded the water for we don't know how many years, but it eventually backed up far enough and pushed its way through. And the gorge is still changing. We have landslides every year in the gorge. Usually the road is, I-84 is closed at least a couple days a year from landslides, snowstorms, fires, etc. The fire was 3 weeks, so it's a very active area. As far as Native American history, because the Ice Age floods kind of obliterated any sign of Native Americans up to that point, we don't have any early history, but the history since then is that there were basically two collections of people between Celilo Falls and upstream to Priest Rapids. There was a group of people that spoke a language called Sahaptin. Their descendants are now Yakima, Umatilla, and Warm Springs. Downriver from Celilo were the Wasco Wishrams, who spoke Chinookan. The thing that all these people shared in common was a salmon culture, this food that we ate today. That was their culture, their religion, their unifying sort of commonality. And Barry told me that you ate salmon at the Celilo Longhouse.
Last year with the Presbyterian Service Care Conference.
Yeah, so you got to experience that. And I've been to the Longhouse and witnessed a potlatch, which is where you bring your goods and you give them away. And that's a Northwest custom. And actually, when Lewis and Clark came through, there were a number of miscommunications. One was that after Lewis and Clark came through the rapids, they'd set all their stuff out on the rocks to dry. Well, to the Native Americans, that was considered booty. That was a potlatch. And so Lewis and Clark thought that these thieving natives, that was a big misunderstanding. When Lewis and Clark came through this place here, they couldn't go through the rapids in their in their boats. They had dugout canoes, so they walked on the trails. Well, to the Native Americans, you paid a toll if you walked on the trails. So there were these miscommunications. And the Native Americans, that typically, when the salmon were not running, they'd pound the salmon into a powder and mix it with fat, like a pemmican. And they gave that to Lewis and Clark after they came out of the mountains because they were starving. They got sick on it. It was too rich for them. So they decided they didn't like salmon. They wanted to shoot game instead. So they missed out on all this bounty of fish. So various misunderstandings. For centuries, the land around the Dalles was kind of the trading mart for a bunch of Indian cultures. They came from the east and the south and the north to trade and get the bounty of the salmon at Celilo Falls. And because of the wonderful warm summer winds, if you set a salmon out to dry, it dries very fast. So it was a great natural phenomena. Unfortunately, smallpox and other diseases disseminated the Native Americans. One of the doctors at Fort Vancouver estimated 90% mortality. And by the time Lewis and Clark arrived in the Columbia Gorge, 1805, perhaps half the population had been extirpated by disease. In 1855, the Nez Perce, Umatilla, Warm Springs, and Yakima entered into a treaty. They ceded millions of acres of land, but retained the right to hunt and fish in their usual and accustomed places. Now the tribes have been basically moved off the river, away from their traditional lands, but have some of the I'd say nicer reservations. The reservation that the Yakima have includes a third of Mount Adams, the eastern slope of Mount Adams. The Warm Springs Reservation includes some of Mount Jefferson. So that's a little bit about the geologic and the native history. I'm going to talk now about some of the campaigns I've been involved in. And for years, the Columbia Gorge, back into the 1900s, was considered as a national park. People wanted to preserve this place. They realized it was special. But nobody ever took it far enough to get that enacted. So right about 1980, the 205 bridge was starting to be completed in Portland, and people could see that there was going to be a lot of development coming this direction. At the same time, a developer bought land right across from Multnomah Falls with a plan to put in like 20 narrow housing lots. And do you know about that? Yeah. Oh, really? Great, great. So the neighboring landowner was John Yeon, and his father was the roadmaster for the historic Columbia River Highway. Yeon's father was a timber guy. He knew how to get men and materials and help build the historic highway. And so John Yeon had a love of the gorge already, and the land that he owned is called the Shire. He's deceased, but he was a major benefactor to Friends of the Columbia Gorge. And he knew Nancy Russell. I'm not sure how. Maybe, do you know how they knew each other?
I think they were neighbors.
Really?
In Portland.
In Portland, yeah. So this property out here that Yeon owned was just a kind of a getaway. Beautiful, beautiful preserve on the other side of Multnomah Falls. And he knew Nancy and knew that she was a housewife, but a very determined and conservation type person. So he schemed and schemed and said, I want to have you and Bruce, your husband, out to the Shire for an evening meal. And he realized that it was going to be a cloudy day, so he had to reschedule. And then he realized that the moon wasn't going to be quite right, so he had to reschedule. So on the third time, he brought them out, and he wined and dined them, and he proposed that Nancy lead this new organization, Friends of the Columbia Gorge. And she said yes. As I said, she was a member of the Portland Garden Club. She didn't know that much about politics, but she was a very determined and fast learner. She had a spine of steel. She was a Republican, but more in the mold of Tom McCall. And she started the organization in 1980. And I'm going to read you a passage from this book, Bridging the Great Divide. This was written by Katie Durbin, a writer for the Vancouver Columbian. And she recounts many of the things that it took to get the Columbia Gorge into National Scenic Act into existence, and the fights that took place. But this is talking about the Multnomah County Executive at the time, Don Clark. And Don Clark was talking to Senator Mark Hatfield, who was the most important Oregon politician at that time. Clark asked Hatfield to support federal protection for the gorge. The senator, Clark said, responded with a 15-minute lecture about how he was not appreciated. He had been a champion for land preservation, and no one had given him credit for that. It had come back to bite him. I listened to that and I said, what were we going to do? Hatfield told Clark, if you get me an army, both sides of the river, both ends of the gorge, Democrats and Republicans, labor and management, if you do that, and if it gets momentum, then I will agree to back legislation and get this through Congress. Hatfield set one more condition. I don't want anybody else to get in the way or interfere. I know how to do this. The way I heard it is Hatfield said, if you get all this, you line up a parade, I'll be the leader of the parade.
And I will take credit.
I will take credit. Clark readily agreed. He was the master at getting things passed. Clark asked his staff to begin recruiting someone impressive to lead the political campaign. He recalled that his administrative assistant, Sally Anderson, came back to me and said, I have found a jewel, a top-drawer, high-class Republican, a member of the Portland Garden Club. When Clark met Nancy Russell, he was impressed. She had class, she was smart, and she wasn't afraid to say, I don't know how to do that. At their first meeting, he offered her the job of leading the campaign. So Friends of the Gorge was born out of that, and Nancy went on for 6 years between 1980 and 1986 to coalesce public opinion, traveling up and down the gorge, advocating for the Scenic Act, the decision of whether to go towards a national park or a national, have this creation be in the National Forest Service system. Department of Agriculture versus the Park Service was a big one, but Hatfield wanted it to be in the Forest Service. So that was the direction they went, and Nancy at one point in Stevenson had her tire slashed. There were billboards against the creation of a preserved Columbia Gorge, and she persevered through it all. She made many trips back to Washington to meet with the politicos, and basically by the time there's just an incredible high water or high trapeze, high wire act that happened in the last minutes of getting the National Scenic Act passed. I can't recount all of it, but one aspect was that Mark Hatfield was the chair of the Defense Appropriations Committee. He held the purse strings on money. And Reagan wanted Star Wars, if you remember. That was the missile defense system. And Hatfield said, you're not going to get Star Wars unless you sign this National Scenic Act legislation. And at the last minute that was possible to do so, I think of the federal, when does the federal calendar end? In October. Reagan held his nose and signed. So that set up what's called the national, the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area, and so that's federal legislation, and it's basically a couple levels below the preservation of what we see as a national park. The thing about the gorge was there were already people living here. There were around 40 to 60,000 people living here. There were, freeways and trains on both sides of the river. It wasn't a pristine, wilderness any longer. So that what the Scenic Act attempted to do and still is working on is be like a quilt, a patchwork, where you have farmland, you have cities, and then you have preserved wildlands. And to a large extent, it's been successful. There are around, I think there's 10 to 12 national scenic areas in the country. This was the second one, but it's